Right. So welcome everyone to this new event of the webinar series organized by the E-Access Forum on Climate Change, Macroeconomics and Finance. My name is Emanuele Campiglio. I'm an associate professor at the University of Bologna, and I will be the chair of the event today with speakers Alain Naef and Camille Macaire. The aim of the forum is to aggregate researchers and policymakers working on topics at the intersection between climate, macroeconomics, and finance. In addition to the webinar series, the forum is also on Slack, and there you will find working papers, news, and conference information. So let me immediately introduce you to the speakers for today's event. Alain Naef is a research economist at the Banque de France. He completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge and followed by a postdoc at University of California, Berkeley. His research mainly focuses on climate finance and financial history. He recently published a paper on the carbon footprint of the Swiss National Bank and currently works on understanding the ownership structure of oil majors. Camille Macaire is a research economist at the Banque de France, focusing on China. She was based in Shanghai for 3 years. She completed her PhD on the reform of the financial system in China with the CEPII University. And previously, she has had a professional experience as an international economist in financial institutions in Paris. So the event will be structured as follows. Alain and Camille will speak for about 35-40 minutes. Please feel free to pose your questions in the chat during the presentation. If these are immediate clarification questions, I will briefly interrupt them for them to address the questions. I will instead postpone deeper questions to the Q&A section. At that point, I will invite you to open your microphone and ask your questions directly to the speakers. I can also do it for you if you prefer. If that's the case, please signal so in the text of the question. So before leaving the floor to our speakers, please let me remind you that the event will be recorded, and let me launch the usual poll of E-Access webinars. So the poll should be appearing on your screens right now. So there are 2 questions. The first question is, should central banks remain market neutral in their monetary policy or use it actively to support climate goals? And the second question is about emerging markets. Which position should policymakers, including central banks, take on economic development and climate goals? I will now leave a couple of minutes for you to answer the questions, and then we can observe the results. Right. So these are the results. Well, the first question, the majority voted that supporting climate goals is more important than market neutrality, although a good quarter of the results also voted for the opposite. And the second question, in emerging markets, countries have the right to pursue economic development goals even at an environmental cost, just as advanced economies have done. This is the most popular answer. Okay, so there's nothing left to do except giving the floor to Alain and Camille. Thank you for being here.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. We're very excited to be here, and very interesting answers to the poll. So interesting to see your answers. We're actually sort of surveying the audience to find what we want to do next in our research project. So that's a great answer to see your answers on these questions, and nice to see support on climate goals versus market neutrality. So that's also interesting because that's something we'll talk about today. Okay, and the last thing I found very exciting in the poll is to see that there's a lot of people from Europe, and that's great because this is really sort of our target audience as well. So we will be talking about China, but sort of very far in the back of our mind is this idea that these policies might be interesting for policymakers in Europe as well. So I think that's really sort of the lens we take here, and that's why we'll maybe not talk more about Europe than China, but we'll talk a lot about Europe as well. So just so you're not confused. Maybe just the formalities. So just to be clear, these are our own views and do not represent the views of our employer. And so what we'll talk about today is greening monetary policy. We'll look at a reform by the People's Bank of China in 2018. And we'll try to see how a central bank can do a reform that can have an impact on monetary policy. And so that's what we'll talk about today. So let me start by giving you a summary so you have everything on one slide. So we studied this 2018 reform, and what happened is that the PBOC, so the People's Bank of China, started to accept as collateral green bonds, and they even favored them as over non-green bonds. So there's a change in how monetary policy is run, and there's a change of what's accepted as collateral. And that will have an impact on the market, and it's this impact that we study. What we do is we use a difference in differences approach, and the specificity of this approach is that we have a very long pre and post trend. So, so if you don't know what that means, we'll show you this graphically very soon, but it's pretty much a way to make sure that our method is sort of robust and that we can show something that's getting closer to maybe causality. I mean, but we're not too hung up on the term really, but it's just what people do. And so our main finding is that this policy by the PBOC lowered the yield of green bonds versus non-green bonds by 46 basis points. And what we're really excited about in this paper is that we're really comparing similar bonds because these are the bonds from the same companies. So everything about these bonds is the same, except the status of green or non-green bonds. And so we really think we have something interesting, a really neat identification to show you that there's maybe room for monetary policy to change things in terms of green bonds. Maybe this is our slide just to protect us or to make sure that we're backed by the highest hierarchy. It's a quote from our central bank governor, the governor from the Banque of France. And we've put it in French, so we can pretty much tell you anything we want about it, and you won't know if what we're saying is actually true or not. And also, so we stick to the original. So what is François Villeroy de Galhau saying? He's saying that central banks were essentially invented with the Riksbank, the first central bank, around the 17th century. And at the time, they were coming to help the Swedish government to run wars. And he's saying that today it's another form of war that central banks have to lead, and that war is alongside the signatories of the Paris Accord in 2015 against climate change and its consequences. So I think there's very much, I don't want to say consensus, but there's very much a view in many central banks that something should be done against climate change in central banks. And there's maybe more of a debate on how this should be done. And this here we show one of these options, the one by the PBOC. And also, since there's a lot of people from Europe, I think almost 70% in this presentation today, we'll focus a little bit on Europe in an introduction to give you an idea of what we have in mind. So there's a very quite famous speech now by Isabel Schnabel in 2020 about this idea that well, maybe there could be some market failures, and if there were some market failures, then market neutrality might not be warranted. And I'll give you some more concrete examples of what we mean by this. And yeah, but this idea is that market neutrality is this idea that you should only do everything the market does, and you should never deviate from what the market does in monetary policy, right? And this idea has been questioned more and more, and there's even voices at the ECB board now that talk about this. So it's an interesting ongoing debate, and we sort of bring an example of a central bank that does not follow market neutrality. And then again, there's another quote from Christine Lagarde, which also says something similar. She also talks about market failures, and then she says that these could be broken in the management of the monetary policy portfolio. So this huge portfolio of the ECB. And so this idea is also present in the literature. I really enjoyed the approach of Dafermos et al., which they look at the portfolio of the ECB and they say, well, it is actually not market neutral because it's biased towards fossil fuel assets. And these assets and because these are historical assets, they're present in bigger numbers. And so there's a clear bias in the way the ECB does its monetary policy. And that's a way of saying, well, the ECB is already not market neutral, so maybe there's something that could be done about this. And then there's Jens van de Klooster and Clément Fontan, who also have a very nice paper and reflecting on it. It's from 2019, and I think if you would show them what's happening today, I mean, in 2019, what's happening today at the ECB level, their paper would probably be very different. So it's nice to sort of reflect on the 2 years since that paper has been written. There's actually been a lot of changes on how things are run in the ECB. I think at the time of writing of this paper, market neutrality was still massively taboo, and now it's something that's debated in public. So that's quite interesting. And so what they show is that market neutrality is basically a way to avoid taking any action, and they analyze the ECB and the Swiss National Bank, and they show how this is done in the different institutions. So yeah, and then there's also a lot of literature on the ECB, and again, so this is just our context. We promise we'll talk about China eventually. If this is what you came for, there's more coming in just a second, but just to give you sort of an idea of where our brains are when we're writing this paper. So there's a really exciting paper which is brand new. I'm not even sure if it's out, so I hope we're not revealing something that's still secret, but there's this really great paper, the first one on the list, which shows that after ECB speeches that go toward more favoring green bonds, after some announcement that are positive towards green bonds, the green bonds versus non-green bonds yields differential moves by 2 basis points, 6 days from any speech or comment. So basically when the ECB announces something that's going in the way of green bonds being more widely accepted, it has an effect on bond prices just by, for example, the speech by Isabel Schneider that I mentioned earlier, that would be an example of an announcement that could have an impact on green bond prices and deals. And then there's some colleagues at the bank, Maisonnier et al., they look at what happens to a collateral in the euro system when it gets accepted as collateral. So before it was not accepted as monetary policy collateral, and then suddenly it becomes accepted. And this is pretty much the same exercise we do here for China. We'll tell you more in detail later, but what they find is a 7 basis point change, and we find a much higher change, but there's reason for that, and we can go back to that later as well. It's a different market and different conditions. And then there's the last paper at the bottom here, which also looks at the ECB portfolio and also argues that it's not aligned with the European Union's targets. So so there's this idea that something might need to be done in terms of monetary policy. And now we're finally going to do what it says on the tin. So we're finally going to talk to you about China and stop talking about Europe. So there is literature as well on collateral acceptance in China, and there's one paper that looks at a reform from 2014, and what they find is that accepting certain bonds as collateral reduced the yield by 40 to 83 basis points. So there's quite sizable effect. And that's what I was saying earlier, when in the Eurozone, you find effects of roughly 7 basis points. It seems that in China, the effects are much larger when you do this kind of operations. There's also sort of a basis effect because in general, interest rates are much higher in China to start with. And then there's the paper by Wang and Wu, which we've spoken to. They do something quite similar to what we do. And they also found, they also look at the same reform, but they look at all different types of bonds, and they find an average effect of 47 basis points. So that's quite reassuring. That means that what we do is not completely out there. But then the question is, what is our main contribution? How do we differ from these papers? Well, the first thing is that our point is really on green monetary policy. So we focus specifically on green bonds. And then we think our identification strategy is capturing much more of the true effect, because we compare bonds from the exact same companies. And we'll give you an exact breakdown of these bonds just in a second. And I'll let Camille take the floor.
Right. So now about China. So just to give a bit of context about why we look at the China case and why it's an interesting case. So actually, what China does in terms of energy transition, in terms of green finance, would be interesting per se, because China is the biggest polluter in the world. So almost 30% of greenhouse gases emissions were produced in China in 2020. So what China does in terms of reducing its emissions and impact, on the real economy in terms of energy transition is an important topic per se in terms of understanding what's going to happen in terms of global warming. So that's the first aspect. And the second aspect is that it's an interesting case study. As a big central bank has done something as regards, green finance and how it could be either replicated or, understood, at least from an international point of view. And just as a case study that could probably be replicated elsewhere. So just to also elaborate a bit more about the Chinese context. So China has pledged to become carbon neutral by 2060. So, it's a huge challenge because, well, now the energy intensity in China is very big. China is a big country also. So it's, in terms of amount, it's the biggest polluter in the world. Also, it plans to reach peak of emissions by 2030, which means that the time lapse between the time gap between peak and net zero would be only 30 years, which is very quick, very challenging. And for example, EU had a similar goal of going from peak to net zero of 60 years. So it's twice as quick as what EU has pledged. So it's a very big challenge, and I think it's maybe not 100% credible as such, but China engages in very big reforms, and at least that's for sure that China is gonna really put a lot of efforts towards reaching this goal. So and China has already really much started these efforts. So actually it has entrenched a concept. It's just a concept, but still is very symbolic of what China does, the concept of ecological civilization in the constitution of the country in 2018. So there's been a very big political focus on this. And it's not, for nothing, it's not only for, political dividend or, diplomatic dividend or position in the global, scale or in international discussions about that. But it's also because it's become a matter of national importance in terms of health, in terms of building a sustainable, economic model. So basically, economic growth in China was incredibly high in the latest decades, and development, urbanization has mainly be done in to the detriment of the ecosystem. So there is a huge air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution. So it is urgent for China, and China has said this, I mean, officially, that the country really engages in a more sustainable path in terms of energy mix and in terms of gas emissions. So there's been some, I mean, a lot of investments. For example, China is the biggest investor worldwide in renewable energies. So that's in terms of investment. It's almost 30% of all investments in renewable energies. So this is very big. And in terms of green finance, and that's the point of our paper, actions have been taken as well. So it dates back to a decade already that China has started to kind of issue guidelines in terms of green finance. And maybe one of the more kind of pioneering attitude in that field is the publication of comprehensive taxonomies in 2015 for green projects and green bonds. So it's been yeah, it's been very proactive in like kind of supporting the development of what was at that time in 2015 a very nascent market, the green bond market. And since then this market has like kind of skyrocketed. Really, it's been it has increased very quickly. And I mean, amongst these reforms to support the green bond markets was this reform that we want to elaborate on, that was in June 2018, and the inclusion of green bonds in the pool of eligible collateral into the medium term refinancing operations facility. Sorry. So in the next slide, we just show the kind of the amounts of green bonds, just to understand where China stands and why it is an important topic. So in 2018, it was smaller, but what we can say that in 2019, China was actually the second biggest issuer of green bonds worldwide. So what we see here in this graph is that actually China has different types of green bonds, and there are like green bonds that are officially recognized as aligned with international standards. And for these bonds, China is the second biggest issuer worldwide. But there's also some other types of green bonds, which are kind of, for example, bonds or financing towards upgrading coal-fired, power generation facilities, for example, to make them less polluting. So I mean, that's laudable, but it's not kind of aligned with international standards. And also bonds that are eligible, or that for like funds that could be used to repay previous kind of credit lines or loans, which is not, I mean, aligned with international standards. So this is just to put into context what the size and the importance of China in terms of green bond, support and development of green finance. So the specific reform that Alain has already kind of talked about is the inclusion into the pool of eligible collateral of the Central Bank of China in 1st of June 2018 of several types of financial bonds, basically 3 types of financial bonds. They were all linked somehow to kind of a social goal. So there were green financial bonds, but also financial bonds to support development of small farms and agricultural kind of areas or projects. So the specificity of green bonds is that they have been granted a preferential status as against the other ones. So to be really honest, we couldn't have very detailed operational kind of details, on why and how this preferential status was used. So it's kind of a pity, because probably we could have had a differential kind of analysis between eligibility premium and kind of preferential status premium, but we cannot. So what we're going to show is actually the kind of the sum of the two, being eligible plus being granted a preferential status. Okay, so that's kind of the reform we're looking at. And in terms of data, so what we really want to do, and what we found very interesting, and I already talked about this, is to match green bonds with non-green bonds with similar characteristics and issued by the same firms. So we really wanted to do kind of pairs. to be able to have or to improve, I mean, the relevance of firm fixed effects. So at the time of the study and at the time of the reform in 2018, the green bond market was not like so big in China. So we had a lot of constraints in terms of data, which is the time frame. We wanted to have bonds that were kind of issued sometimes before the beginning of our time frame, and for which maturity were going quite a few months after the end of our time frame, to be sure that we don't have some kind of specific, um, um, change in the yields due to beginning and end of life of the bond. We wanted them to be financial bonds, green, and also that we can find a pair with non-green bonds issued by the same firms, etc., etc. So in the end, but it's, I mean, it's almost a comprehensive, I mean, data set for what we want to look at. We didn't like kind of pick the one we wanted. It's really all the bonds that we found that had all these kind of specificities. We have a 10 green and 10 non-green bonds for our time frame, which ranges from late 2017 to late 2018. So we have 7 issuing firms, and basically the main difference, as already said, is the green statute between green bond and non-green bonds. Yet, and that's what we show in the next slide. So we show the name of the issuers. So it's all financial institutions basically, because we are talking about financial bonds. And so basically we have some discrepancies between green and non-green bonds, especially in terms of maturity. So that's kind of a limitation, but that's the best that we could get actually. So I mean, we can come back to this if you like. But what we want to elaborate on, and just kind of what was the main purpose of our study, is the graph that we have in the next slide, and which shows you, and I mean, we first saw this graph and said, okay, we just need to do a study about this because this is too good. So basically here, the dots are the mean of the spread between green and non-green bonds, with the max and mean of the difference. So just to clarify this point that I just saw, our data are retrieved from Bloomberg, and basically there is a kind of a green bond label on Bloomberg. So it could be quite controversial, and here again could be a limitation since it is kind of self-assessed as green. And for China, it most probably includes, I mean, surely includes those bonds that are not aligned with international standards. So we really want to make clear here that, I mean, and this is going to be in our conclusion, that we don't want to like know if it had an actual impact on the real economy, or the link between green finance and kind of energy transition, etc. This is, I mean, beyond the scope of the study, but we just want to check what was the impact on a very like simple financial terms of the reforms in terms of yields of green bonds. So I hope I've been clear. So what we have here basically is a treated group, which is the green bonds, and a non-treated group, which is the non-green bonds. And we're conducting a difference in differences. So this is a very simple kind of model type to just discuss this, but we want to show if there has been a divergence in trend between the treated group and the non-treated group. And this divergence, if significant, would be the impact of the reform. Okay, so I mean, this is a very simple definitive, basically. So the model is here. So we study the yield of the bonds, and that's why. And we have several dummies. So the first dummy is the T dummy, which accounts for treated or non-treated variables. Then we have the post dummy, so the P dummy, which accounts for prior to the reform or after to the reform. And what we actually look at when conducting a definitive is the factor relating to the interaction of the two dummies. So this is beta 3 that we want to investigate more. And we add some firms fixed effects, which is the point that we've been discussing before. So that's basically the model, and that are the results. So what we show is that the interaction between the two dummies is significant. So it's treated and post together, and significant, and had a with a factor of minus 46 basis points, basically. So the result shows that the reform had a significant effect, and that the spread between green and non-green bonds kind of increased by 46 basis points. Okay, so the yield of green bonds decreased when compared to non-green bonds by 46 basis points. So this is very static analysis. We have like a time frame before the reform and after the reform, and we just compare the two kind of groups, and we show that there is a difference. But what we wanted to do is conduct a more timely analysis with time effects, so kind of dynamic analysis, to see what was the persistency of the shock and how it evolved through time. So it's great because with bond yields we have very granular data because it's daily data. So what we do is do some sub periods. We do quarter, months, and weeks sub periods. And what we do, and that's kind of the regular kind of robustness check for diff and diff, is that we test kind of as a placebo test one sub period that is just pre or the reform, with all the other sub-periods that are pre or the reform. Okay, so we want to show actually, if possible, that the kind of if we include a shock between the two sub-periods that were pre or the reform, actually the shock is not significant. We have a similar trend. Okay, and that if we take this time period that is just pre or the reform versus after the reforms, then we have a positive and significant divergence. Okay, so in the next slide, we just show what would be the ideal results. So basically, we test T-1, which is the subperiod just prior to reform, with all the subperiods that are prior to reform, and we want to show that it's not significant, that it's close to zero, and then that we have significant and persistent effects. Okay, so that's the ideal world, and that's what we get with our data. So this is quarterly. So basically, we show here that there's no like kind of divergence in trends between Q-1 and Q-2. So this means that there's no pre-trend. Okay, which actually allows us to analyze the divergence in trend, because this means that all things equal, well, the two groups would have evolved similarly. But then we have the shock of the reform, and then we show that we have a significant shock, and that is kind of increasing through time. And then we go a bit more into granular data, and we do exactly the same, but with monthly subperiods. We show that there's no pre-trend with non-significant factors before the reform, and significant and like with a single, a specific kind of persistency through time after the reform. So what we show is that the reform didn't have a immediate effect, but here, for example, during the first months, we have a kind of a non-significant effect, but it kind of starts to emerge, and then the effect kind of increases through time and has a maximum kind of effect after 3 months. And then we do the same with week, and we show that it's true that the first weeks, during the first weeks, the impact was not so significant, and that it becomes really significant after 4 weeks. So this is basically the results of our study, and then I leave the floor to Alain just for a kind of conclusion and discussion.
Great, thanks a lot. Okay, let me move on from here. And I hope you appreciate the very smooth slide passing I was trying to do while Camille was talking. So I hope that wasn't too disruptive. Okay, so I'm just going to discuss some of the policy implications and also limitations. I think one of the things we really want to be clear about the limitations of this study, and I think Camille has done a great job pointing some of the limitations already, but I'll just I'll add a few to that. So I think one of the reasons this reform is very exciting is because the PBOC is one of the first central banks to have targeted green bonds directly in its monetary policy. And to go back to the chat about market neutrality we had at the beginning, this is exactly how such a policy could look like to not follow market neutrality. Another point we really, something we really like in this reform, or that's interesting to learn from this reform, is that by doing so, the central bank also helps the market develop. So there's an effect on the bond yields, but there's also sort of a reassuring effect to know that the central bank is going into that green bonds market. And that's something we sort of label developmental central banking. So the idea of a central bank, especially in an emerging market, going into a nascent market and showing its presence to reassure future investors that there'll always be a sort of buy of last resort if needed, or at least that there's someone in this market that's buying and selling. So we think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from for emerging markets. So we've done comparisons with the ECB, and I think one of the reasons this is not exactly directly necessarily applicable to the ECB is that the ECB already accepts green bonds. Now the difference with the PBOC is that the ECB does not have a preferential status for green bonds. They just accept them along with all other bonds, right? So there's some scope for ECB policy as well. And then the other very big limitation of this paper is really that we do not show any effects on the real economy, right? So this is purely the effect on the market price of an asset on the secondary market, and that doesn't tell us if more windmills are being built or if there's actually a transition happening. But for this, there's this other paper I've mentioned before already. So again, I'm not really sure if it's out, so hoping I'm not divulging trade secrets of its authors, but I really suggest you check it out when it comes out, or if it's already out, or get in touch with the authors. But it's really a very cool paper. And they use a theoretical model to try to show this link that we are not able to show between the impact on bond yields and the real economy. And just to give you an idea of, so again, this is completely beyond the scope of what we do, but that's just to let your mind wander and ask us questions or enter the dialogue. So this is a chart which shows so green bonds and normal corporate bonds and non-green corporate bonds, as well as sovereign bonds in China. And so the green bonds are in green and their scale is on the right-hand side. And so you can notice straight away that it's much smaller than the normal bonds. But you can also see that something's happening to the trend. And again, the thing we don't show is that we don't know if this reform had any impact on issuance, because obviously issuance is going up after the reform, but there's probably more than the reform that makes this issuance go up. So as much as we're quite confident to say that the reform clearly had an impact on yields, here we don't know if there was an impact, and that could be potentially a future study, or maybe someone else could jump in and look at that question. And also really, I think that's sort of the argument we had about developmental central banking, is this idea that, well, there's no causality here. This is just a chart we're showing you. It's just food for thought. But, when a central bank jumps in, there's potential to also maybe help a market develop. And I think that's pretty much it. So our conclusion is quite straightforward, right? We showed that this change of policy reduced the yield of green versus non-green bonds up to 46 basis points on average. And I think we're quite confident to stay behind this result. It's quite a robust result. We've also done some robustness checks that are not here, but yeah, we're quite confident that this is more or less the effect of this policy, and it's quite encouraging, I'd say. This can be interesting for other central banks. So either in this sort of developmental finance idea of like creating a new market, or if there could be ideas for more advanced economies, central bank to pick up on as well. And then, yeah, I think the real gap or the real thing to still look at, and that we really do not do here, is to know how this has impact first on the primary market and then second on the real economy. And so these are two questions to look at. And yeah, I think that's it for us. I'm not sure if there are any questions.
Right. So thank you very much to both for this interesting talk. I will invite anyone in the audience with questions or comments to raise their hands, or to please put their question in the Q&A section. Before doing that, let me also say one thing, that the paper by Francesco Giovanardi and co-authors that was mentioned, I'm pretty sure that it was the same paper that was presented as part of the e-access webinar series a few events back, probably around March. So if you're interested in the paper, you can also go and look at the presentation by Francesco. I will also ask Gabriela Mundaka, who posted a question. I think Camille should have addressed your question already, but please raise your hand if not, and we can go a bit deeper. So in the meantime, I will give the floor to Markus Molbach-Ingholt. You are now unmuted, so please feel free to pose your question.
So thank you both for a super interesting presentation. It was, I really enjoyed it. So one question I have, I believe that you showed this matrix to begin with, that there were some social bonds that got the one treatment, but not the other treatment. So my question is, well, why can't you use these social bonds to disentangle the effect between inclusion into the collateral framework on the one hand, and then on the other hand, yeah, exactly that one. And then on the other hand, the preferential status treatment. Yeah, so they're not social bonds, they're SME and agricultural bonds.
Shall I answer? Like quick answer, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, super ID. I think maybe a limitation and is that we really wanted to. So it's kind of a small universe, and the great thing with green financial bonds that basically we can compare with non-green financial bonds issued by the same firms, and I think it's quite important because otherwise, I mean, it's very few bonds, and then here I'm pretty like sure there's almost no firm that have issued both green financial bonds and both like kind of agricultural financial bonds, or the universe would be too small, but that would be a limitation. But actually we didn't really look into this option, so probably that's a very good, very good idea. That would be my first insight, but we're gonna check this.
Okay, thank you. One other thought I had is so to get an idea about the realism in the size of the effects that you're estimating. I mean, how does the size of this effect correspond to the say the standard deviation of yields in the Chinese bond markets? Because if the standard deviation is commensurate with what we for instance find in European bond markets, then it's just about the variance being higher in the Chinese bond market. Yeah. So essentially estimating a relative effect rather than estimating an absolute effect.
Yeah, so maybe I can try to start to answer, then Camille can correct me if needed. But like, I think this is just showing you the data. So these are the averages of the differential. So you can see it's pretty steady in general, but there is some sort of volatility to it. I don't have the actual standard deviation in mind, but I think the other thing to remember is that interest rates in China are much higher, right? And that's part of what explains the difference with Europe. So in Europe, we're very low at the moment. And so a very small difference in basis points is actually quite a huge relative difference. Whereas in China, interest rates are much higher. And so this higher difference might not be, I mean, in comparison is not that much higher than the estimates we have in Europe. But maybe Camille has something as well.
Yeah, no, yeah. So this kind of the universe of this kind of bonds would be typically 300 basis points, or between 3 and 400 basis points in terms of yields. So it's kind of 10%, you know, deviation. So it's not like small, I would say, but it's true that it's in a high, I mean, rate environment. That's for sure. So, I mean, just basically agree with what Alain said.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Marcus, for your question. Gabriela, I will now give the floor to you. Can I also ask everyone to please introduce themselves very briefly? Thank you.
Yes. Hi, I'm Gabriela Mundaka from the World Bank. No, I just could you explain a little bit more on this before and after and the spread? Because usually we talk about spread when you have already something established, you know, and then, you know, say corporate bonds. You study the spread between Microsoft and Apple, right? So how is it? Because they have been there already. But when you talk about here, the spread between the green bonds and related to what happened before the reform, did you already have established green bond? What is the definition of your pre-policy, right? It is not clear to me. How can you distinguish those two periods?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great question, right? Yeah, I think it's always a bit confusing, and even we get confused sometimes when we talk about it. But I think now we'll try to get it right for you. So you can see here. So this is at already minus, I want to say like 36 or something. So you can see there's already a minus, right? And this minus number here is quite constant on average, and that's the difference between the spread of a green bond and a non-green bond. So there's naturally already a spread difference because people prefer green bonds to non-green bonds, right? And then what we measure are 46 basis points. You can actually even see them on this graph, and that's what we really love about this paper, is that we've done the econometrics, but actually we really didn't have to, because you know the graph is just so clear. If there was no referee, we would have just put this graph and left it here. And so the 46 basis points difference is the difference between this line you can see here that I'm drawing with the pencil and this line here. And so the difference here is roughly 46, because you go from, let's say, well, I don't have the actual numbers, but maybe minus 36, you go to, let's say, you know, minus 100. And that's pretty much the, or maybe my math is not completely right, but yeah, this is the minus 46 that you can see here, right? So it's the difference between green bonds and non-green bonds before versus the difference between green bonds and non-green bonds after. Yeah, but maybe Camille can say it better.
Oh yeah, it's just that yeah, and we've been discussing this in an earlier presentation. It's true that pre-order reform is the actual greenium, right? It's like, and then we have kind of a eligibility premium that kind of adds up to that, and this is actually what we've measured. But does this answer your question?
Yes, it's okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so let me move to another question that is instead in the Q&A section by Patrick Flynn. The question is, what are the risks of adding green bonds to a central bank eligible collateral list?
Yeah, maybe I can show you an extra chart which we had in reserve. It's always nice to show an extra chart. I don't think there's any big risk, right? So the ECB is doing this at the moment. So this is a picture of the ECB portfolio, and you can see. So these are non-green bonds here on the right-hand side, and these are the green bonds. So they already do have green bonds as a collateral. So I'd say there's no risk. I mean, the risk in Europe, for example, would be that the ECB buys all the green bonds, and you can see they already have roughly 25% of green bonds available at the moment. So that's quite a lot. So the risk, I think that's maybe the biggest risk, would be that if the central bank gets too excited and buys all the green bonds available, there'll be none for market participants, and that might maybe be an issue. But in terms of actual risks, especially in the case of China that we study here, these are the exact same banks, right? So they're banks issuing bonds. And so the risk of a green and the non-green bond should be, I mean, you know, unless you can think of a challenge, should be exactly the same, I want to say, because they're just the risk of the bank going down, right? And that would be the same for its green and non-green bonds, I would assume. So yeah, I don't think there's any risk of any specific risk to green bonds, if that makes sense. But
yeah, and just to add up, actually, yeah, these bonds, they have a rating, such as exactly the same other bonds. So you can just restrict to highest, ratings. What was interesting with China is that they decided to kind of lower the minimum rating. And that means that actually they accepted to take a bit more risk in including these green financial bonds, but it's the same with the other type of bonds. And basically, so it's very important to understand that in China, central bank is not independent, so they kind of contribute to the central planning and central kind of industrial strategy of plans. So basically, if they decided to take a bit more risks by including this kind of lower rated bonds, it means that they kind of considered that the risk was worth it in terms of economic impacts.
Great, thank you so much. So now I would leave the floor to another question by Franz Nauschnig. Please, Franz.
Hello, yeah?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, my question is, what do you think we have negotiated with the European Task Force on Carbon Pricing with the Chinese, and they have now implemented also a carbon pricing system. Do you think this will help with carbon pricing system? And how is the relationship between this green finance, with collateral system, with the carbon pricing system? And would it be for the ECB to become more market neutral if we also accepted a lower rating for green bonds and added a risk premium for brown bonds, so to say? So as to have an overall risk remain the same.
Okay, so probably I'll answer the first question, and if you have some insight on the second one. So basically, what China does in terms of green finance is quite wide, and there's been a lot of initiatives, and in particular, there are like carbon markets that have been developed in several cities, and now China has kind of unified this several carbon markets. There was 7 big carbon markets. So now, and it's very new, it's been a few months, it's the biggest carbon market in the world. So it's just, I mean, to give some bit of context. So then, I mean, the link between what the central bank does and what is done in terms of carbon market obviously is important in China, because I mean, no central authority is independent basically, so it's kind of part of the same strategy. But then, I mean, in terms of what China can do or discuss with Europe, I mean, this is kind of separate topic, I would say, and I don't have much insight about this specific question, I would say. But just to give you, I mean, a very general question, it's interesting that China engages in these things because it becomes very big. For example, in terms of carbon pricing, it's the biggest carbon market in the world. So it is both an interesting case study for us, and also it's gaining a lot of diplomatic power because it's big in these international discussions, I would say. So yeah, it's just a bit of context.
Yeah, and I guess I think the other thing as well to remember is that in terms of carbon pricing, I mean, this is something that's sort of beyond the scope of central banks. So I think that's why we don't think there's any room for this. But this is a political process which, you know, will take its course or not, depending on political wills of the people. Well, at least in Europe, maybe less in China. But and so I guess this is not necessarily something a central bank can be active on, whereas this slight tilting of the monetary policy is much more in the scope of the central banks. And then the idea, the suggestion you have for the ECB, I mean, I think that's an interesting idea. I mean, it could definitely be something to accept lower rated bonds, green bonds, and add a premium on non-green assets or on polluting assets. I think that's an interesting idea. But yeah.
Thank you. We have another question by Yun Zhu. I don't know if you want to raise your hand and we can unmute you, or I can just read the question, however you prefer. Okay, let me read it, but please feel free to jump in. I see you're unmuted. So in the chart about sovereign bonds, corporate bonds and green bonds, do you know the issuer of green bonds? Is there any substitution effect between green bonds and the other two types of bonds? i.e., instead of issuing traditional bonds, governments and corporations decided to issue green bonds instead? How to reconcile the rising amount of green bonds and the previous accumulation of bad loans? That's the question.
So quick answer maybe. So it's difficult for sure to see if there is any substitution effect, like, yeah, just firms like making the most of this new policy and just jumping in. What I can say is that, for example, in 2020, so it's been a very peculiar year. So China was kind of a bit lower in the global podium. It was fourth biggest green bond issuer. But what we've seen a lot of new kind of new demand that was linked to change in the kind of the economic, like actual demand. For example, there's a huge demand for electrical vehicles in China, for example. It's the biggest market worldwide. And there's been a lot of real estate firms that have issued or asked for green financing to, for example, put some electrical appliances or like appliances to be able to plug your electrical car in your apartment. So basically, just to say that there's been new needs. It's not only substitutions, that's for sure. And these new needs were also, by the way, supported by the authorities in this big, race towards reducing carbon emissions. So this is only a partial effect. Partial answer. And how do you reconcile rising amount and the previous accumulation of bad loans? This is, I'm not sure this is exactly on the same scale, because green bonds is small while bad loans are very huge. So, this is so minor as regards to, bad loans in China. And also, most of the non-performing loans in China, they are mainly like, they're mainly for like micro firms or small firms, like kind of almost unipersonal, firms. There are a lot of these kind of micro firms in China. And I would not think it's the same firms who are kind of seeking for green financing. But this is just some insight, and I have no exact figures for this. That would be my first thoughts on this question.
Right. So unfortunately, we're at the end of this webinar. Let me thank Camille and Alain again very much for being our speakers tonight. Let me also remind you about the next event. So this will be on Monday, May 17 at 6 p.m. CET and 12 p.m. Pacific time US. The speaker will be Renato Faccini, who is the deputy head of research at the National Banque of Denmark. And the talk will be entitled Dissecting Climate Risks are they reflected in stock prices? So thank you again to the speakers and to all of you for attending, and see you soon.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Very pleasant discussion.
Thank you.